The morning sun cast a golden glow over London as Catherine adjusted the small navy coat on her youngest child. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from nervousness about the ceremony ahead, but from the weight of what this day meant for their family. William stood by the window of Kensington Palace watching the crowds already gathering along the processional route. He could hear the distant sounds of anticipation building across the city. Charlotte stood perfectly still as her mother smoothed down her dress, a cream-colored creation that matched her mother's elegant outfit. The young princess had been practicing her walk for weeks, determined to do everything just right. She understood even at her age that today was special. George, the eldest, wore his suit with the kind of quiet dignity that sometimes surprised his parents. He had asked his father the night before if he would be nervous, and William had told him the truth, yes, but having his children beside him made everything easier. Louis, the youngest of the three, couldn't quite grasp why everyone seemed so serious. He tugged at his collar and asked his mother if they could bring his toy car. Catherine knelt down to his level, her eyes soft with understanding. She explained that today they were going somewhere very important, a place where their whole family would be together, and sometimes being together was the greatest gift of all. Louis seemed to accept this, though he still wished he could bring at least one small toy. The palace staff moved quietly through the rooms, making final preparations. William's private secretary briefed him on the timing, but his mind kept wandering to his children. He remembered his own childhood, the weight of expectation, the cameras always watching. He had promised Catherine long ago that their children would have as normal a childhood as possible. Yet here they were, preparing for one of the most public moments of their young lives. Catherine caught her husband's eye across the room. Without words, they communicated what they both felt, pride mixed with protectiveness. They had discussed many times whether to include the children in today's ceremony. Some advisors suggested it might be too much pressure, too overwhelming, but William and Catherine believed that family meant facing important moments together, supporting each other through whatever came. The time drew closer. A gentle knock at the door signaled that the cars were ready. William gathered his three children around him. He didn't give them a speech about duty or responsibility. Instead, he simply told them that no matter what happened today, no matter how many people watched or what anyone said, they were loved. That was what mattered most. George nodded solemnly. Charlotte reached for her mother's hand. Louis asked if there would be cake afterwards. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the waiting vehicles, Catherine noticed how George stayed close to his younger siblings. He had taken his role as eldest seriously, perhaps too seriously for an 11-year-old. She made a mental note to make sure he knew it was okay to just be a child sometimes. The weight of future responsibilities would come soon enough. The convoy of cars stood gleaming in the palace courtyard. Security personnel maintained their positions, but Catherine noticed how several of them smiled warmly at the children. Even those tasked with protection couldn't help but be moved by the sight of the young family preparing for such an important day. William helped each child into their designated vehicle, making sure seatbelts were fastened and that Charlotte's dress wasn't creased. Inside the car, the world seemed to quiet down. Through the tinted windows, they could see crowds lining the streets, but inside it was just them, a father, a mother, and their three children. William reached across and took Catherine's hand. They had been through so much together over the years. Public scrutiny, private challenges, moments of joy and grief. Through it all, they had built something precious, a family that loved each other genuinely, deeply. The journey to the Abbey began. George looked out the window at the sea of faces, flags, and cameras. He asked his father if all these people had come just for today. William explained that people came because they cared, because they wanted to be part of something meaningful, because hope and tradition and family still mattered to so many. George seemed to ponder this, his young mind trying to understand the complex relationship between their private family life and their public role. Charlotte practiced her wave, the gentle rotation of the wrist that her mother had shown her. She wanted to do it perfectly to make her parents proud. Catherine watched her daughter with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Charlotte was growing up so fast, already learning to present herself to the world. Catherine hoped that beneath all the protocol and expectations, her daughter would always remember to be true to herself. Louis had fallen quiet, which was unusual. Catherine checked on him, worried he might be feeling overwhelmed. but he was simply watching his older siblings, trying to understand what was expected of him. He was the baby of the family, often protected from the harsher realities of their unique position. Today he was beginning to sense that their family was different from others, though he couldn't quite articulate how or why. The Abbey came into view, its ancient spires reaching toward the sky. This building had witnessed centuries of history, countless royal ceremonies, moments of national celebration and mourning. Today, it would witness something equally important: a family choosing to stand together, children by their parents' side, facing whatever came with united hearts. William felt his chest tighten with emotion. He thought about his own mother, about how much he wished she could be here to see her grandchildren. She would have loved them so fiercely, would have fought to give them the childhood she had always wanted for him. In a way, every decision he and Catherine made about raising their children was influenced by those memories, those wishes for something better. The car slowed as they approached the Abbey entrance. Through the windows they could hear the roar of the crowd, see the flash of cameras, feel the intensity of attention focused on them. In moments they would step out into that world, into history, into the roles they had been born or married into. But before the doors opened, William looked at each of his children and smiled. Catherine squeezed his hand. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they faced everything. Together, with love, with hope, and with the quiet courage that comes from truly belonging to each other. The car door opened, and suddenly the muffled sounds of the crowd became a wave of cheers and applause that washed over them. William stepped out first, his movements practiced and confident despite the butterflies in his stomach. He turned immediately to help Catherine, extending his hand to her with the same gentle courtesy he had shown on their wedding day all those years ago. She emerged with grace, her smile genuine despite the hundreds of cameras pointed in their direction. George was next, and as his feet touched the ground outside the Abbey, he paused for just a moment. The sheer number of people, the noise, the energy of it all, it was more than he had imagined. His father's hand on his shoulder steadied him, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone in this. George straightened his shoulders and walked forward, looking more like a young man than a boy in that instant. Charlotte followed her brother, and as she stepped from the car, something magical happened. A little girl in the crowd, roughly her age, waved enthusiastically at her. Charlotte's rehearsed composure broke into a genuine grin, and she waved back with real joy. Catherine saw this exchange and felt her heart lift. Despite everything, despite the formality and the protocol, her children could still find moments of authentic connection. Louis needed a bit more coaxing. The noise frightened him slightly, and he clung to his mother's hand as he emerged into the daylight. Catherine bent down, whispered something in his ear that made him giggle, and suddenly he was brave enough to walk forward. William watched this tender moment between his wife and youngest son, reminded once again of why he had fallen in love with Catherine, her ability to bring comfort and normalcy to even the most extraordinary situations. The family grouped together at the base of the steps leading up to the Abbey entrance. This was the moment that would be captured in countless photographs, replayed on news broadcasts around the world, frozen in time as a symbol of continuity and family unity. But for William and Catherine, it was simply a moment of taking a breath together before walking into whatever came next. The Abbey's ancient doors stood open before them, and from within came the sound of the organ, its deep notes resonating with centuries of tradition. William offered his arm to Catherine, while George positioned himself carefully to walk alongside his siblings. Charlotte took Louis's hand without being asked, a gesture of sisterly protection that made Catherine's eyes mist with tears she couldn't shed in public. They began to climb the steps, their pace measured and dignified. With each step, William felt the weight of history, of all those who had walked this same path before him. His grandparents, his father, his mother. They had all ascended these steps for various ceremonies and occasions. Now here he was with his own children, continuing a legacy that stretched back generations while trying to forge something new and better. Louis stumbled slightly on one of the steps, and immediately both George and Charlotte tightened their grips on his hands, keeping him upright. William and Catherine exchanged a quick glance, both thinking the same thing. Their children were learning to look after each other, to be a team. Whatever challenges their unique positions might bring, At least they would have each other. Inside the Abbey, the temperature was cooler, and the sounds from outside faded to a distant murmur. The ancient stone walls seemed to absorb noise, creating an atmosphere of reverence and peace. Rows of dignitaries, family members, and honored guests stood as the family entered. Hundreds of faces turned toward them, some familiar, many not, all watching with varying degrees of interest, curiosity, and expectation. Charlotte felt her mother's hand squeeze hers reassuringly. The Abbey was more magnificent than she had imagined, with light streaming through stained glass windows, creating patterns of color on the stone floors. She tried to remember everything her parents had told her about this place, about its importance in their family's history, but mostly she just tried not to trip over her own feet. George walked with careful precision, aware that people were watching his every move. He had asked his father once why people cared so much about what they did, why strangers felt invested in their family's life. William had explained that sometimes people needed symbols of continuity and stability, that their family represented something larger than themselves. George didn't fully understand, but he knew it meant he had to be careful, considerate, aware. As they progressed down the aisle, Catherine's mind flickered through memories. She thought about the young woman she had been when she first met William at university, never imagining that one day she would walk through Westminster Abbey with their 3 children by her side. She thought about the doubts she had faced, the scrutiny, the questions about whether someone like her belonged in this world, and yet here she was, and her children, their children, were a bridge between the past and the future. William noticed familiar faces among the assembled guests, family members who had supported them through difficult times, friends who had remained loyal despite the complications that came with such public lives. He thought about the private conversations he and Catherine had late at night, about how to raise their children with both awareness of their responsibilities and the freedom to be themselves. It was a delicate balance, one they constantly struggled to maintain. The children could see the front of the Abbey now, where the ceremony would take place. Louis whispered to Charlotte, asking how much longer, and she whispered back that they needed to be patient. Catherine heard this exchange and felt grateful for Charlotte's natural kindness toward her youngest brother. Sibling relationships could be complex, especially under the pressure of public life, but her children genuinely cared for each other. They reached their designated positions, and as they settled into place, William looked at his family assembled beside him. 3 young faces, so innocent yet already bearing the weight of expectation. Catherine, his partner in all things, the person who had transformed his understanding of what family could mean. In this moment, surrounded by history and tradition, what he felt most strongly was love. Simple, profound, uncomplicated love for these 4 people who meant everything to him. The ceremony began with words that had been spoken in this place for centuries, rituals that connected the present to the past. But William barely heard them. His attention was on George, who stood so straight and serious, on Charlotte, who clutched her mother's hand while trying to look brave, on Louis, who had begun to lean against his father's leg, seeking comfort and security, on Catherine, whose eyes met his with perfect understanding. Outside, the crowds continued to wait, to celebrate, to witness from a distance. Inside the Abbey, a family stood together, bound not just by duty or tradition, but by the invisible threads of genuine love and mutual support. Whatever this ceremony meant to the nation, to history, to the continuation of royal tradition, to William and Catherine it meant something simpler and more profound. It was a moment when they could show their children that family meant facing life's important moments together, that no one had to stand alone, that love was the truest foundation of all. The ceremony progressed with solemn beauty, each element carefully choreographed, yet somehow still feeling intimate despite the grandeur of the setting. Charlotte watched the proceedings with wide eyes, trying to memorize every detail so she could write about it later in the journal her grandmother had given her. She had promised to record important family moments, and this certainly qualified. George noticed his father's jaw tighten slightly during one portion of the ceremony, a tell he had learned to recognize when William was feeling emotional. The young prince understood more than his parents sometimes realized. He had read about his grandmother Diana, had asked questions that were difficult to answer, had begun to grasp the complicated legacy he would one day inherit. But today wasn't about burden or duty. His father had made that clear. Today was about being together. Louis had grown restless, which Catherine had anticipated. She had quietly slipped him a small toy from her bag, breaking protocol in a way that would have horrified some of the more traditional advisors. But Catherine had never been one to prioritize appearances over her children's comfort. Let people judge if they wanted. Her son needed something to occupy his hands and mind, and she would not make him suffer through anxiety just to maintain some outdated notion of rigid formality. The Abbey's choir began to sing, their voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling in harmonies that had been perfected over generations. The music seemed to transform the space, adding layers of emotion to an already powerful moment. Catherine felt tears threatening and blinked them back, not wanting to cry in front of the cameras that she knew were positioned throughout the Abbey. But the music touched something deep within her, perhaps the awareness that her children were growing up so fast, that moments like these marked the passage of time in irreversible ways. William glanced down at his children, each so different in temperament, yet united in their shared experience. He wondered what they would remember about today when they were older. Would they recall the majesty of the setting, the importance assigned to the ceremony? Or would they remember smaller things? The way their mother adjusted Charlotte's collar one more time. The way their father's hand rested protectively on George's shoulder. The way they all stood together when it mattered most. A reading began, words about family and continuity and service. Catherine listened, but also found herself distracted by the play of light through the stained glass windows. The colors shifted and changed as clouds moved across the sun outside, creating an ever-changing pattern of illumination. It reminded her that nothing stayed the same, that life was constant change and adaptation, and that the only real constant was the love within a family. George felt the weight of his future more keenly in this moment than perhaps ever before. He was old enough to understand that one day, many years from now, he would stand in places like this not as a child beside his parents but as the central figure. The thought both terrified and motivated him. He wanted to be worthy of the trust being placed in him, wanted to honor his family's legacy while also creating something meaningful of his own. But those were thoughts for the future. Today he was simply a son standing beside his father. Charlotte's foot had fallen asleep, and she shifted her weight as subtly as possible. She had learned from watching her mother how to endure physical discomfort without showing it, how to maintain composure even when every instinct screamed to fidget or complain. It was one of many small lessons in self-discipline that came with their position. Yet even as she stood perfectly still, she remained a child, imaginative, curious, full of questions she would ask later when they were home and away from watching eyes. The ceremony reached a particularly moving moment, one that had been planned to honor family connections across generations. Catherine felt William's hand find hers, a subtle gesture that probably violated some rule of protocol, but that neither of them cared about. They had learned over the years that certain things mattered more than rules. Authenticity, support, showing their children that even in public settings, love and partnership were paramount. Louis had dropped his small toy, and it rolled slightly away from where they stood. His immediate instinct was to chase after it, but George's hand on his arm stopped him gently. The older brother retrieved the toy with minimal disruption and returned it to Louis with a whisper about being careful. Catherine witnessed this exchange and felt her heart swell with pride. Her children were learning not just protocol and duty, but genuine care for one another. The Abbey filled with the sound of hymns, sung by the congregation with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skill. William remembered his own childhood experiences in this building, how long the ceremonies had seemed, how heavy the expectations had felt. He had tried to prepare his children for what today would be like, but no amount of preparation could fully capture the reality of standing in Westminster Abbey with the weight of history and the gaze of the nation upon you. Catherine caught sight of a family friend seated several rows back, someone who had known her since before her relationship with William had become public knowledge. The friend smiled warmly, a reminder that beneath all the pageantry and protocol, Catherine was still herself, still the woman who valued loyalty and authenticity, still someone who had chosen this life not for its privileges but for love. As the ceremony continued, Charlotte found herself thinking about her friends at school. They would probably watch recordings of this day, would see her standing here in her formal clothes surrounded by grandeur, She wondered if they would understand that she was still the same person who liked to climb trees and draw pictures, who sometimes forgot her homework and got grass stains on her uniform. The thought made her slightly sad, this gap between who she truly was and how the world saw her. George noticed his father's eyes becoming glassy with unshed tears during a particularly poignant moment of the ceremony. It was comforting in a way, seeing that his father, who always seemed so strong and composed, also felt deep emotions. It made their shared humanity more apparent, made the weight of their roles seem more bearable, knowing that feeling deeply was not a weakness, but a strength. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion, each ritual element building upon the last to create a complete whole. William thought about the circularity of life, how his own parents had stood in places like this with him as a child, and how now he stood here with his own children. The cycle continued generation after generation, each adding their own chapter to an ongoing story. Catherine made a mental note of several small adjustments they would need to make if they were ever in a similar situation again. Perhaps a shorter ceremony for Louis, who despite his best efforts was clearly struggling with the length. Perhaps more preparation for Charlotte, who seemed to be taking everything so seriously that Catherine worried she might be putting too much pressure on herself. Perhaps more reassurance for George, who already seemed to carry the future on his young shoulders. The final blessing was pronounced, words of hope and continuity echoing through the ancient space. As they prepared to process back down the aisle toward the entrance, William gathered his family with a glance. This was it. They had made it through the ceremony together, had supported each other through every moment. Now they would walk back out into the sunlight, into the waiting crowds, into the rest of their lives. But they would do it as they did everything, together with love as their foundation and family as their strength. The walk back down the aisle felt different from the processional entry. There was a sense of accomplishment, of having made it through something significant together. George walked with slightly more confidence now, his earlier nervousness replaced by quiet pride. He had done it, stood through the entire ceremony without fidgeting too much, maintained his composure, represented his family well. These small victories mattered to him more than adults might have guessed. Charlotte waved to several familiar faces in the congregation as they passed, her natural warmth breaking through the formality of the occasion. Catherine noticed and smiled, grateful that her daughter retained this ability to connect with people genuinely. So much of royal life could become performative, mechanical, a series of prescribed gestures and responses, but Charlotte's spontaneous friendliness was real, and Catherine hoped she would never lose that quality. Louis had perked up considerably now that the ceremony was ending. He could sense the shift in energy, the movement toward something less formal. He tugged on his mother's hand and whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear that he was hungry. Several people suppressed smiles, charmed by the young prince's honest expression of a basic need. Catherine whispered back that they would eat soon, but first they needed to greet some people outside. William felt the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease as they approached the Abbey doors. The hardest part was over. His children had been magnificent, patient, dignified, yet still themselves. He had worried that the formality might overwhelm them, that the pressure might be too much. But they had risen to the occasion while still maintaining their essential childlike qualities. He was proud of them in a way that had nothing to do with duty or royal expectations and everything to do with being their father. The doors opened, and once again they were met with a wall of sound, cheers, applause, the clicking of hundreds of cameras, but this time it felt different. They had accomplished something together, had made it through a significant moment as a united family. The crowd's enthusiasm felt less daunting now, more celebratory than overwhelming. They paused at the top of the Abbey steps, the perfect position for the photographers gathered below. This too was part of the choreography of royal life. The pause that allowed for pictures, the moment frozen in time for newspapers and history books. But even as they stood for the cameras, William reached for Catherine's hand and she reached for his. A simple gesture that reminded them both that beneath all the symbolism and ceremony, they were simply two people who loved each other. George stood slightly apart, trying to emulate his father's stance and bearing. He had studied photographs of his grandfather and great-grandfather, trying to understand how they had managed to look both approachable and dignified. It was a balance he was still learning, this dance between being relatable and representing something larger than himself. Sometimes the weight of it exhausted him, but today, with his family around him, it felt more manageable. Charlotte had spotted the little girl from earlier in the crowd and waved again, delighted when the girl waved back even more enthusiastically. It was a small moment, easily overlooked among the grand gestures and official protocols, but it mattered. It reminded Charlotte that behind all the formality, there were real people with real feelings, and making someone smile, even a stranger, was worth the effort. Louis was distracted by a fly that had landed on his sleeve. In his mind, the ceremony was over, and therefore there was no need to stand still anymore. Catherine gently redirected his attention, pointing out something interesting in the crowd, a man holding a sign with their family's names on it. Louis studied the sign with interest, momentarily forgetting about the fly. The family began their descent down the Abbey steps toward the waiting cars. The crowd pressed closer, held back by security barriers and personnel, everyone wanting a glimpse, wanting to be part of this historic moment. William could see faces in the crowd, elderly women who had probably followed his family for decades, young families with small children, tourists who happened to be in London at the right time. Each of them had their own story, their own reason for being here. Catherine noticed a woman in the crowd wiping tears from her eyes. The sight moved her deeply. She would never fully understand what their family represented to some people, what hopes or dreams or connections to the past they symbolized. But she could honor those feelings by taking her role seriously, by raising her children with love and values, by trying to be worthy of the trust placed in them. As they reached the base of the steps, a group of school children who had been given special positions near the barriers began to cheer loudly. George looked toward them and offered a slight smile, unused to such direct enthusiasm directed at him. One of the children shouted his name and he felt his face flush slightly. It was strange being recognized by strangers, having people know things about him that he hadn't chosen to share. But the children seemed friendly, not invasive, and he tried to receive their attention graciously. Charlotte was more comfortable with the crowd's attention. She had inherited her mother's gift for making people feel seen and valued. As they walked toward the cars, she made eye contact with as many people as possible, her smile genuine and warm. Several people in the crowd commented on how lovely she was, not just in appearance but in demeanor. Catherine overheard these comments and felt grateful that her daughter's natural kindness was apparent, even in such formal circumstances. Louis had tired of walking and tugged on his father's hand, a universal signal that he wanted to be carried. William bent down, scooped his youngest son into his arms, and continued walking. This simple act of fatherly care probably broke some rule of protocol, but William had learned that some things mattered more than maintaining rigid formality. His son was tired and needed comfort, and providing that comfort was more important than any photograph or public perception. The crowds continued to cheer as they approached their cars. William could see that his children were beginning to tire, the adrenaline of the ceremony wearing off and exhaustion setting in. They had been troopers, but they were still children with limited reserves of energy and patience. It was time to get them somewhere quiet, somewhere they could relax and simply be kids again. Before getting into the car, Catherine turned back toward the Abbey one more time. The ancient building stood majestic against the London sky. Witness to centuries of royal history, today it had witnessed her family's moment, had held them in its sacred space as they marked another milestone. She felt a complex mix of emotions: pride, gratitude, exhaustion, and a deep appreciation for the ordinary miracle of her family's love. William helped each child into the car, making sure they were comfortable and secure. George settled into his seat with relief, glad to be out of the public eye. Charlotte kicked off her shoes immediately, her feet aching from the formal footwear. Louis snuggled against his mother, suddenly quiet now that the excitement was over. As the car doors closed, the noise from outside became muffled, creating a bubble of privacy and peace. The convoy began to move, pulling away from the Abbey and beginning the journey back to Kensington Palace. Inside the car, the formality melted away. Louis asked about the promised cake. Charlotte wanted to know if she had done everything correctly. George wondered aloud how long the ceremony had lasted. William and Catherine answered their questions patiently, helping them process what had been an extraordinary experience. As they drove through London streets lined with well-wishers, Catherine looked at her husband and children and felt overwhelming gratitude. They had made it through together, had supported each other through every moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she knew there would be many, they would face them as they faced everything, as a family, united by love and commitment to each other. The ceremony at the Abbey had been about many things: tradition, continuity, duty. But for Catherine and William, it had been about something simpler and more profound, showing their children that family meant standing together, especially in life's most significant moments. The palace gates swung open to receive them, and suddenly they were in private space again, away from the cameras and crowds. The relief was palpable, especially for the children. Charlotte immediately asked if she could change into comfortable clothes, and Catherine assured her she could as soon as they got inside. George had maintained his composure throughout the journey, but now his shoulders sagged slightly with exhaustion. Louis had fallen asleep against his mother, worn out from the excitement and emotion of the day. William carried Louis inside while Catherine walked with George and Charlotte, one hand resting on each of their shoulders. The palace staff greeted them with warm smiles, genuine affection showing through their professional demeanor. These were people who had watched the children grow, who had comforted them when they were upset and celebrated their small victories. To them, the royal family was not just duty. They were real people who deserved care and respect. Once inside their private apartments, the transformation was immediate. Charlotte ran to her room to change, calling back that she never wanted to wear fancy shoes again. George headed to his own room but paused at the doorway, turning back to his father. He wanted to know if he had done all right, if his parents were proud of him. William crossed the room and pulled his eldest son into a hug, telling him that he had been remarkable, that they couldn't have been prouder. Catherine settled Louis onto a comfortable sofa in the family sitting room. He stirred briefly but didn't fully wake, his small face peaceful in sleep. She brushed hair from his forehead. This baby of the family who had handled a difficult situation far better than anyone might have expected. She thought about how quickly they were all growing, how these precious years of childhood were passing faster than she liked. The promised cake arrived, along with sandwiches and fruit, comfort food after a long formal event. Charlotte emerged in jeans and a sweater, looking like any other child her age except for the sophisticated way she had styled her hair. Old habits died hard, even when seeking comfort. She immediately grabbed a sandwich and flopped onto a chair with the kind of casual abandon that would have been impossible an hour ago. George joined them, also changed into casual clothes. He seemed thoughtful, processing the day's events in his characteristic quiet way. William recognized the look. His son was trying to make sense of what their lives meant, why people cared so much about their family. These were questions William himself still grappled with, questions without easy answers. He sat beside George and simply kept him company, offering silent support rather than trying to explain the inexplicable. Catherine began to relax for the first time all day. The ceremony had gone well, their children had been wonderful, and now they were safely home where they could just be a family without the weight of public expectation. She knew the photographs would be analyzed, articles would be written, opinions would be shared, but right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was her daughter eating cake with enthusiastic messiness, her eldest son deep in thought, her youngest sleeping peacefully, and her husband finally allowing his own exhaustion to show. Charlotte wanted to talk about everything she had seen and experienced. She described the colors of the stained glass windows, the sound of the choir, the feeling of walking down the aisle with everyone watching. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and even George smiled at her animated descriptions. She had a gift for finding joy in experiences, for focusing on the beautiful rather than the burdensome aspects of their unique life. Louis woke up and immediately asked about cake, making everyone laugh. Catherine brought him a piece, and he ate it with the single-minded focus of a tired child who had been promised something sweet. He seemed to have no memory of falling asleep, no particular interest in discussing the ceremony. For him, the day's highlight was right here, cake in his hand, family around him, comfortable clothes, and no need to sit still. William looked around the room at his family in this moment of unguarded casualness. This was what he had always wanted. A real family life despite the artificiality of their position. He and Catherine had worked hard to create spaces where their children could simply be children, where formality gave way to genuine connection. Days like today were necessary, part of their role and responsibility. But moments like this, messy, relaxed, authentically loving, these were what sustained them. The conversation turned to plans for the evening. Charlotte suggested a family movie, something funny that required no thought. George agreed, admitting that he was too tired to concentrate on anything serious. Louis wanted popcorn to go with the movie, negotiating for more treats despite having just eaten cake. Catherine and William exchanged amused glances, these normal parenting moments feeling especially precious after hours of formality. As the afternoon faded into evening, they gathered in their private screening room, a concession to their unusual life but used for utterly normal family activities. They chose an animated comedy that all three children enjoyed, something light and entertaining. Louis climbed onto his father's lap, Charlotte curled up beside her mother, and George sprawled on the floor with pillows, his preferred movie-watching position. The movie played, but William found his attention drifting. He thought about his own childhood, about how different his experience had been from what he was trying to give his children. His parents had loved him, he knew that, but the expression of that love had been complicated by duty, protocol, and personal struggles. He and Catherine were determined to do better, to make their children feel secure in their love even while preparing them for their eventual roles. Catherine was having similar thoughts. She remembered the early days of her relationship with William, the scrutiny she had faced, the doubts about whether she belonged in this world. Now here she was, raising three children who would always be in the public eye, trying to give them tools to handle that pressure while also protecting their childhoods as much as possible. It was an impossible balance, but she was determined to keep trying. George had stopped watching the movie and was instead thinking about a conversation he had overheard between his parents last week. They had been discussing his future, the responsibilities that would one day be his. He had pretended not to hear, but their words had stayed with him. He understood that his life would never be entirely his own, that choices would be limited by duty and expectation. But watching his parents now, his father making Louis laugh, his mother brushing hair from Charlotte's face, he also understood that family love could make almost anything bearable. Charlotte laughed at something in the movie, her amusement genuine and infectious. She had the gift of living in the present moment, not worrying too much about the future or dwelling on the past. Catherine hoped she would keep that quality, even as life inevitably brought challenges and complications. The ability to find joy in simple moments was precious, especially for someone whose life would be lived partly in the public eye. The movie ended, and Louis announced he was hungry again, despite the earlier feast. Catherine laughed and suggested dinner, though it would be a casual meal. Just family, no staff unless necessary, no formality. They would eat in the kitchen like any normal family, serve themselves, clean up together. These rituals of ordinary life were important, grounding them in something real and honest. As they moved toward the kitchen, William caught Catherine's hand and pulled her back for a moment. He wanted to tell her how grateful he was, for her, for their children, for the life they had built together. The ceremony at the Abbey had been about many things, but for him it had been a reminder of what truly mattered. Not the crowds or the cameras or the historical significance, but the simple fact that he got to walk through life with people he loved and who loved him back. Catherine squeezed his hand, understanding without needing many words. They had been through so much together, had made countless sacrifices and difficult choices, but they had also created something beautiful, a family bound by genuine affection, children who knew they were loved, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together just as they had faced today. Later that evening, after dinner had been eaten and cleaned up together, Catherine found George sitting alone in the library. He had a book open on his lap but wasn't reading, just staring out the window at the darkening sky. She sat beside him quietly, not forcing conversation but simply offering her presence. After a few minutes, George asked the question she had been expecting. Why did they have to live such a public life? Why couldn't they just be a normal family? Catherine considered her answer carefully. She could give him the official explanation about duty and service, about their family's role in the nation's history and identity, but George deserved more than rehearsed explanations. She told him the truth, that sometimes she wondered the same thing, that she wished she could give him and his siblings a simpler life. But she also explained that their position gave them opportunities to do good, to help people, to represent values that mattered. The key was finding balance, protecting what was private while fulfilling what was public. George listened, his young face serious with concentration. He asked if it ever got easier, this constant awareness of being watched and judged. Catherine admitted that in some ways it did. You learned coping mechanisms, developed thicker skin, became better at separating your private self from your public image. But in other ways it never got easier, because you remained fundamentally human, vulnerable to criticism and hurt. The important thing was having people who loved you for who you really were, not for your title or position. William appeared in the doorway, having gone looking for them. He took in the scene, his wife and eldest son having a serious conversation, and understood immediately what they were discussing. He joined them, adding his own perspective about the struggles and rewards of their unique life. He told George something important, that he didn't have to figure everything out now, that he was allowed to just be a child, that the weight of future responsibilities would come soon enough without borrowing trouble from tomorrow. Charlotte peeked into the library, sensing that something important was happening. She had been playing with Louis, but he had fallen asleep again, exhausted from the long day. She asked if she could join them, and William extended an arm, inviting her to cuddle beside him. She did so happily, and suddenly they were a family unit, again, minus one sleeping member, processing the day's events. Together, Charlotte wanted to know if they would have to do many more ceremonies like today's. Catherine explained that there would be others over the years, some formal, some less so, but that they would always face them as a family. She emphasized that their job was to support each other, to be kind when the world felt harsh, to remember who they really were beneath the titles and expectations. Charlotte seemed satisfied with this answer, her natural optimism asserting itself again. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, funny moments from the day, things that had gone slightly wrong but that no one else would have noticed. The way Louis had asked about cake at the most inappropriate times. They laughed together, finding humor in situations that had seemed stressful at the time. This ability to laugh at themselves, to not take everything too seriously, was crucial to their survival as a family in such unusual circumstances. William talked about his own childhood experiences with formal occasions, how terrified he had sometimes been, how lost he had felt. He wanted his children to know that struggle was normal, that feeling overwhelmed didn't mean you were failing. He also wanted them to know they had something he hadn't always had. Two parents united in their commitment to protecting their children's well-being, even when that protection came in conflict with tradition or expectation. Catherine shared stories about her own adjustment to royal life, the mistakes she had made, the times she had felt like she didn't belong. She wanted Charlotte especially to understand that confidence was often a choice, that you could feel uncertain inside while still presenting yourself with dignity. She also wanted both children to know that their mother had not been born into this life, that she had chosen it, and that love had made all the difficulties worthwhile. George asked a question that surprised them, whether his parents ever regretted their choices, whether they wished they could have had different lives. William and Catherine looked at each other, communicating silently before William answered. He was honest, yes, there were moments when they wished for more privacy, more freedom, more normalcy. But regret? Never, because every difficult moment, every sacrifice had led to this: a family they loved, children they adored, a life that for all its challenges was also filled with purpose and meaning. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, processing this honesty. Then she said something profound for her age, that maybe the hard parts made the good parts feel even better. That maybe if everything was easy, they wouldn't appreciate what they had as much. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes at her daughter's wisdom. Despite all her worries about how their unusual life might affect their children, Charlotte was developing into a thoughtful, empathetic person capable of finding meaning in difficulty. The library had grown dark around them, lit now only by a single lamp in the corner. Outside, London continued its evening rhythms, millions of people going about their lives unaware of the intimate family moment happening behind palace walls. This was the paradox of their existence, so public yet so private, so watched yet so protected, So ordinary in their love, yet so extraordinary in their circumstances. William suggested they check on Louis, make sure he was properly tucked in. They moved as a group to his room, where they found him sprawled across his bed, still in his clothes, small face peaceful in deep sleep. Catherine gently removed his shoes and covered him with a blanket, not wanting to wake him. George and Charlotte kissed their little brother goodnight, and William stood for a moment just watching his youngest son sleep, marveling at his innocence and hoping fiercely that they could preserve it as long as possible. Back in the hallway, they said goodnight to each other with hugs that lasted a little longer than usual. George thanked his parents for being honest with him, for treating him like someone capable of understanding complex truths. Charlotte hugged them both tightly, whispering that she loved them and that today had been special, even the hard parts. They watched their two older children head to their respective rooms, then stood together in the quiet hallway. Catherine leaned against William, letting him take some of her weight. She was exhausted, physically from the long day, emotionally from constantly managing appearances and protecting her children. But she was also content. They had done it. They had walked through a significant moment together as a family, had been authentic in their love for each other even in the most formal circumstances. Their children knew they were loved. That was what mattered most. William held his wife, thinking about the journey they had taken together. From university students falling in love to young parents navigating unprecedented public scrutiny, to this moment, standing in a palace hallway, their children safe and loved, their family intact and strong. The path had not been easy, but it had been worth it. Every difficult choice, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led here, to a family built on genuine love rather than merely duty. They walked to their own room, ready for rest after the demanding day. But before turning out the lights, Catherine checked her phone one last time. Already the photographs from today were everywhere. Their family on the Abbey steps walking down the aisle, Louis being carried by his father. The images showed what the public saw, a picture-perfect royal family marking an important occasion. But Catherine knew the truth behind the photographs, the real story that the cameras couldn't capture. The real story was George asking difficult questions and being given honest answers. It was Charlotte finding joy even in formal circumstances, her natural warmth breaking through protocol. It was Louis falling asleep against his mother, because he trusted her completely to keep him safe. It was William and Catherine choosing each other and their children over and over again, even when easier paths might have existed. The real story was love, imperfect, challenging, but absolutely real. As she drifted toward sleep, Catherine thought about the future. There would be more ceremonies, more public moments, more times when their family would be on display. There would be challenges she couldn't yet anticipate, struggles her children would face that she couldn't prevent. But there would also be more ordinary evenings like tonight. More conversations that deepened their understanding of each other. More reminders that beneath all the titles and traditions, they were simply a family trying to love each other well. William was already asleep beside her, worn out from the day's demands. Catherine looked at him in the dim light filtering through the curtains. This man who had chosen her, who had built a life with her, who shared her commitment to raising their children with both preparation for their roles and protection of their humanity. She thought about their children sleeping safely down the hall, about the life they were all creating together day by day. The day had been about duty and tradition, about marking an important occasion with appropriate ceremony. But in the end, it had really been about something simpler and more profound. It had been about a family choosing to stand together, children by their parents' side,